I'm very excited to be hosting this event as the Jack Layton Chair. The Jack Layton Chair is the position I've had the privilege of holding for the last 2.5 years. And I'd like to just say a few words about the Jack Layton Chair as we head into the event. Jack Layton, here in Canada, we have an international audience today, which is quite exciting. Here in Canada, taught in politics at our university. He also became the leader of the opposition of the New Democratic Party of Canada, a party which Sara Singh is a representative of, and led the opposition at the federal level of government. He was an advocate of social justice, an advocate of social approaches to governance. The Layton Chair, which is now in its 9th year, seeks to promote civic engagement of students, the collaboration of university and community, the promotion of equity and diversity, and a transdisciplinary approach to subjectivity, subject engagement, and knowledge creation. And today's event perfectly reflects those kinds of principles of the Layton Chair. The Layton Chair is supported by the Dean of Community Services, the Dean of Arts, and the offices of the President. And we're very thankful for their support, and particularly for their support for today's event. Now, today's event. Keegan Hobson, who is the administrator or administrative assistant to the chair, mentioned in a matter in the fall, we've been dealing with relationships of caring in our events. And today, and that this is so timely in a time of COVID, today we are going to hear about the central importance of relationship in change and politics without oversimplifying the concept of relationship. You're in for a treat. We've been working this up together since, I guess, late spring, early summer. We have a great combination of academic thinking and pragmatics of practice, and we're enlivening ideas to promote change and support. Hagit, who you see, is joining us from Tel Aviv. And Sara Singh is joining us from Queen's Park here in Ontario, where she's a representative. I just want to mention a few of the places that people are registered from. We have some people from McGill University, from York University, from the University of Sussex in UK, the University of Bristol, Community Living, Mississauga, University of Pennsylvania. And I apologize for those of you who I'm missing. I mean, and quite a big representative here from our own university. And I encourage you to put greetings in the chat to the presenters and to each of us to let us know where you're from and who you are. A few thanks right at the beginning. I want to thank Keegan Hobson, Lorena Ryan, and Sarah Fumley, who are assistants to the chair and students here at our university, because they have been key to promoting this event and to keeping it organized. I'd now like to introduce Patricia Albanese, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts, who will do the land acknowledgement and greetings from the Dean of Arts.
Thank you so much, Ken. Good afternoon and welcome to Relationships of Resistance with our special guests, Dr. Sara Singh and Dr. Hagit Sinai-Glazer. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, as Ken mentioned, and this is a very small part of our deeper commitment towards reconciliation. This university is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. As more of us make our way back to campus this semester and next semester, you'll find some changes to the spaces that we took for granted as we rushed past each other towards our classes almost 2 years ago. As you step back on campus after your long absence, please stop and take a moment to reflect on the land that our university sits on. Parts of the space were once home to the Toronto Normal School, a teachers' college at Church and Gould founded in 1847, where it's very likely that some of those who came to teach at residential schools received their training. I hope that our inhabiting of this space as a university means that we'll not forget who were the original inhabitants of this land and how the work that happened in this space came to be used against Indigenous peoples and Black Torontonians. I hope that being situated on this space and us coming together today means that we welcome the work that we need and can do together to listen, learn, and teach each other in the hope of co-creating a more just and inclusive society. The Jack Layton Chair, which Ken Moffat is the person who organized the event and so on, and who's currently holding the chair, is part of a joint commitment between the Faculty of Arts and Faculty of Community Services, as Ken already mentioned. This commitment is a commitment to community engagement, to social justice, and social change. And I'm delighted to be a part of today's event and to welcome you all on behalf of the Faculty of Arts in this important dialogue, because as an educational institution, we still have a lot of learning to do ourselves and loads of work ahead. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. I'd now like to introduce Kieris Garabagi, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Community Services. Kieris, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Ken. I welcome everybody to this event. I won't take up a lot of space or time, but I want to basically say two things. One, that I think, you know, it is really worthy to pause for a moment and just consider the importance of the events generally that Ken, with his various partners, has put on as part of the Jack Layton Chair series. You know, these are conversations that don't happen very often, that don't take place in disciplinary classrooms or classrooms based on particular disciplinary learning. And yet they're so important because they hit at the very heart and soul, really, of how we are together and how we live together in society. So this particular event, the previous ones, and undoubtedly the ones to come, are, I think, some of the most important events, really, that come out of the kinds of academic spaces that we have. And so thank you, Ken, first of all, for continuously thinking about how to shape conversations or how to give impulse to conversations that are about how we are together. I think there is no more important conversation than that. Secondly, I just want to say, you know, on behalf of the Faculty of Community Services, we are involved with institutions that in name at least serve communities, and all of which have strong mandates to do so in inclusive and social justice oriented ways. And yet, I just love the topic today, thinking about relationships as sites and spaces of resistance. In part because it is very apparent that that many, especially large and traditional institutional structures, really are working very hard to prevent relationships, or to render relationships politically neutral. And so we are, in fact, at a moment of tension in which we have to find ways through relationship to resist power, to resist structures that continue in a very nuanced way to uphold and perpetuate different kinds of inequities and so on. So what a phenomenal conversation we're about to have. I'm grateful for it. And on behalf of the Faculty of Community Services, welcome everybody.
Thank you, Kieris, for your kind words. Much appreciated. I am now going to introduce Esther Ignani, who is the Director of Disability Studies here at Ryerson University. Her research interests center on intimate citizenship in disabled cultures. She's interested in understanding how private lives of disabled people are shaped by public institutions and cultures that assume and demand able and sane body minds. She uses the arts and work with artists whenever possible to advance research process. These have the potential to make university research more accessible, engaged in a broader array of audiences. Welcome, Esther.
Thanks, Ken. It's really my pleasure to be here this afternoon and to introduce our two guests. So our first guest with us today, and we've already heard a little introduction, is Sara Singh. So Sara Singh is currently the member of provincial parliament in Brampton Centre. She's also the deputy leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party. She is a community advocate, educator, and artist, and a co-founder of the organization Broadening Horizons, an arts-based organization committed to engaging young people in taking social action on social justice issues. She received her PhD in policy studies at our university, specializing in social policy. She also received her Master of Arts in International Development Studies from St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And she received her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from York University's Glendon College. She is passionate about creating social change and addressing social justice issues in the community. So welcome, Sara. Our second speaker on the panel is Hagit Sinai-Glazer. So Hagit is a social worker who completed her PhD in social work at McGill University. And she's currently completed postdoctoral studies and holds a tenure-track position in Israel. Her work explores how the everyday facets of the facets of everyday practices of social workers are shaped by social, professional, and institutional organization and structures. Her work takes up how social workers and service users work with, through, and against these constraints. So welcome to both our speakers. And Sara, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you everyone for being here. It's an honor to share some space and have some important dialogue with everyone today. And I would like to just thank Ken and his team for creating this opportunity for us to have these important discussions. As he mentioned, a lot of planning has gone into our discussion today, so certainly looking forward to it. And I know that Hagit also has a few words to share before we get started with our presentation.
I just want to also extend my gratitude to Ken for putting this all together. I'm very excited and humbled to be here. Looking forward to our discussion. Thanks, Sara.
Thanks so much, Hagit. I think, I appreciate us being able to connect across the oceans and have these important discussions. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm just going to take a second here to share my screen and load my presentation. Wonderful. And I just want to apologize to everyone about the ringing in the background. I am at Queen's Park and we do have some votes happening on some motions. So the bells will probably ring for a little while. So appreciate your understanding. As was mentioned, my name is Sara Singh, and I did complete my doctoral research at X University this year. And I was very honored to have the support of Dr. Moffat, along with Dr. Albanese, as a committee members and external members as well, and helping to guide the research that I conducted. Now, my research looked at the diffusion of inclusive post-secondary education in the province of Alberta. A really important topic, and I'll share a few reasons, in terms of what inspired this research and what I found in terms of the relationships and the importance of those relationships in actually moving past what were, institutional structures that would have prevented the implementation of inclusive post-secondary education, but the importance of those relationships and helping them persevere. I started some of my advocacy as a board member at Community Living Brampton Caledon Community Living, and transitioned over to a board director at Community Living Ontario. And this advocacy around, policy changes for people with disabilities really stems from also being a sister of a person with Down syndrome. And in her experience and walking with her, I realized that there were many barriers to post-secondary education for individuals with intellectual disabilities here in the province of Ontario in particular. This led me to look at initiatives that were providing space and educational opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities in other provinces. And it led me to Alberta, where since 1987, they've been able to implement successfully inclusive post-secondary educational opportunities for students with disabilities, even the most severe disabilities. And I questioned why other provinces maybe weren't able to implement these initiatives at the rate that Alberta was. And this is what really sort of founded the research and the research question in terms of, what contributed to those, the diffusion of inclusive post-secondary education in Alberta. And what I did was a qualitative case study where I conducted 12 semi-structured in-person interviews with key informants in Calgary and Edmonton, Alberta. These were folks that were directly involved with the creation, implementation of inclusive post-secondary education. And to really understand the diffusion of that innovation of inclusive post-secondary education, I used a diffusion of innovations framework, which allowed me to look at the innovation itself, which we will discuss, the communication channels that were required to make this innovation happen, as well as the time that it took and the social systems. And through my research, I grouped those findings into 4 overarching themes, which I'll share a little bit of those findings with you now. So what I found was that inclusive post-secondary education as an initiative, I just want to be clear first that my research wasn't about assessing the level of inclusion, the merits of the innovation. It was more about understanding how this was able to flourish and the factors that contributed to that. So in understanding that the innovation did have merit, because previous studies had indicated that, I focused on what about inclusive post-secondary education in Alberta allowed it to be successful. And what I found through those interviews and conversations was that the approach to creating access for students was really problem-driven, not necessarily policy-driven, which was interesting for me as a policy studies student, but that the innovation itself was created to address the lack of opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities during a period of deinstitutionalization. But the innovation itself underwent constant processes of adaptation and critical reflection through those that were involved in the creation and implementation. So the ability to be flexible, to adapt the innovation, to meet the needs of the institutions, as well as the students and community, really contributed to its ability to be implemented over the long term. I also found that the innovation relied heavily on opinion leaders people like those involved in formerly Community Living Alberta, now called Inclusion Alberta. And so, I term those folks as opinion leaders. These were folks that, had the capital and power to push forward the idea of inclusive post-secondary education. And they relied heavily on interpersonal networks that they built with families, with the institutions themselves, along with community stakeholders, to leverage those relationships and move forward in implementing inclusive post-secondary education. And so these folks are really policy entrepreneurs that really took advantage of that policy window becoming open during that period of deinstitutionalization, and leveraged those relationships to demonstrate the value of inclusive post-secondary education and have it be implemented over a period of time. But this was very dependent on having inclusion facilitators at each of the campuses. These facilitators played a key role in building and maintaining the relationships to ensure that students were included in classrooms, that they had their curriculum modified, or that if they had any needs that needed to be met, that there was someone available on campus to assist them, and build those relationships with, whether it be a program director, a dean, or external partners. Inclusion facilitators were critical in this process of diffusion. I also found that Alberta had a very strong provincial advocacy network. As I mentioned earlier, Inclusion Alberta and the families that they were able to mobilize worked together effectively to implement inclusive post-secondary education. And they often did this with very little support from the government. While there was some funding support being provided through other mechanisms, they weren't directly for inclusive post-secondary education. So despite this, because of those relationships, as we discussed earlier, the Provincial Advocacy Network worked with those families to ensure that space was being created and that they were taking up that space at those institutions. And as I mentioned earlier, reinforcing conditions such as deinstitutionalization and changes in the disability rights movements during the time really helped, I think, be a catalyst for why inclusive post-secondary education was seen as an innovation and something that institutions, despite sometimes their unwillingness to provide the support, were open to the idea of implementing an initiative at their institution, whether that was a college or university. And the important point that I found was that this success did not happen overnight. It happened over a period of 30 years. And so the diffusion of this innovation over that period of time meant that, as I said earlier, there was room and space to constantly adapt the innovation to ensure that it was meeting the needs and outcomes that they intended it to, but to slowly build those relationships with key gatekeepers, but to also control the quality of what inclusive post-secondary education would look like. In 2004, because there were key actors that came into Inclusion Alberta and other inclusion facilitators that were hired, we saw a boom of the inclusive post-secondary educational initiatives across the province. This happened for a few reasons. They were able to demonstrate the merit, and because of those key actors who were able to continue to foster relationships, they were able to successfully diffuse inclusive post-secondary education even further. So as I said earlier, this was problem-driven, not necessarily policy-driven, which I thought was very interesting because often we do feel that a policy is what promotes inclusion. But this instance, in this example, what we found was people responded to the problem of individuals not having educational opportunities as they left institutions and were integrated into the community. And they relied heavily on a strong and active provincial advocacy network and family networks who were committed to seeking change. Now, the Provincial Advocacy Network created family leadership opportunities, provided the support to families in order to push forward. And so these interpersonal connections and this ongoing communication and training really helped mobilize families to demand better and to not settle for anything less. The opinion leaders, such as faculty or family members as well, or those from Inclusion Alberta, played a critical role in advocating for inclusive post-secondary educational opportunities. It got to the point that at some institutions that did not have inclusive post-secondary educational opportunities being offered, they saw what was happening in other colleges or universities and then wanted to have something similar implemented because they saw the value and merit that was demonstrated over time. And I think an important point in understanding the diffusion process was that there was a deliberate decision to expand inclusive post-secondary education slowly. There wasn't a rush to grow. And I think that's a very important point. The incremental change element here is critical to understanding how that success was built over time and how those relationships of resistance were able to be sustained over the 30 years. But it, again, also meant that there was constant critical reflection, constant adaptation of the innovation, again, to meet the needs of community. For example, if there was an initiative that perhaps was not providing the opportunities that the Memorandum of Agreement laid out, there was space in the way that the initiatives operated to work with the institution, to have those conversations, and to adapt to meet the needs of the institution as well as the student over time. And I wanted to share a few quotes from some of the interview transcripts, because I think they really capture the sentiment of how those relationships and this desire to push forward and resist the institution's motive to exclude students, I think really captures what families and Inclusion Alberta sought to do. And it really all started with a group of parents who wanted something other than those traditional services for their sons and daughters with disabilities. And that idea in 1987, 1985, when they first started to conceive it, it required a lot of social imagination. And at that time, it was a very novel idea to think of people with disabilities, no matter how severe they were, to be sitting in a university classroom along with their peers and engaging in that educational opportunity. This was something that took imagination in order to even dream of the possibility of doing that. And I think that it highlights those relationships because looks like the slide that came out of nowhere. So I'm just going to go to this one. I think it highlights those relationships and how they worked with professors. They looked at individualizing the initiatives to ensure that, again, those in the classroom and students and administrators all felt comfortable with what they were engaging in and saw value. So it wasn't imposed on them. They worked with them to create these opportunities. And as one interviewee expressed, it was much more about the relationship building than it was about any sort of policy or practice, whether that was governmental or operational through the university. But they built these relationships to take up space unapologetically, and often, operating in a basement, for example, with very little resources, but still making sure that students were included in classrooms and on campus in every way that they could. And so I think for policy studies, this study provided a framework for understanding the diffusion of innovations and the processes around them and the actors that are often involved in creating change and implementing an innovation. It also helped highlight the role of policy entrepreneurs and the importance of taking advantage of policy windows, as we saw with Inclusion Alberta and Family Networks in Alberta in the early 80s. It also showed us that incremental change can result in larger social change. And that's exactly the approach that was taken, was slow and steady, but consistent. And that did result in a growth in the initiatives, but also a wider acceptance of students being on campus, regardless of how severe their disability was. It also highlighted the importance of social systems, those networks, those relationships, to drive social innovation and create change. And critical friends who, out of those interpersonal relationships that are developed, provide that feedback of what's working, what's not working, what can be done better. And having the ability to adapt the innovation, to take into consideration that critical reflection is so important, I think, to helping an innovation like this, again, a fairly novel concept, to be received over time in the way that it was. And I think from a critical disability studies and critical policy studies perspective, it really showed us that we need to take up space, and disrupting the status quo sometimes requires us to build those relationships, but to continue to work within those institutions and outside of them to take up that space. And I think that that's a really interesting finding, because I think that in this case, they were able to demonstrate how from working from the outside in, really this innovation was able to be successful. And I know that Ken wanted me to chat a little bit about my current role and how this research and findings sort of impact some of the work that I do. And I think, as a sister, ally, researcher, and advocate, and now current elected member, it really helped me understand the importance of building those relationships, in working with community groups to mobilize those that want to see social change happen, but also how they can navigate those power structures and create the change that they'd like to see. And in this example, those relationships were fundamental to helping not only people understand the importance of inclusive post-secondary education, but actually moving forward to implement initiatives. And so in the work that I do now, I keep that at the forefront of the advocacy and the conversations with different groups, and share with them the importance of persevering, but also not being afraid to take up space even when you're being told not to. So with that, I want to thank you all, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later.
Thank you, Sarah. So many interesting thoughts there, and I'm also looking forward to our discussion later. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Hagit.
Thanks, Esther, and thank you, Sarah. And again, I want to extend my gratitude for Ken for sort of bringing us all together. So good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here today. For me in Israel, it's already evening, so it's just past 7:30 p.m., which is also known as the all hell breaks loose time with young children. So there might be some interruptions. My apologies in advance. I'm a social worker. I did my bachelor and master in Israel. And then I spent 7 years in Montreal. I completed my PhD at McGill, another year of postdoc at UDM, and then another year of postdoc with the Azrieli Foundation. And I very recently started my tenure track position at the School of Social Work at Tel Aviv University. And today I want us to explore together the idea of relationship as resistance in the context of social work and public social services. And the project I will draw from today is field work. I did it at Social Services Department in Israel. And this work was not set up to find or conceptualize resistance, not at all. It was all about trying to better understand the ways in which the helping relationship and social work are socially organized to occur as they do. So my premise was, and still is, that the personal and private is political and public. And from this perspective, I wanted to better understand the helping relationship in social work. So how is it that a seemingly private encounter between a social worker and a client, usually these both would be female women, is actually an encounter that is shaped and situated within institutional regulations and professional expectations and social norms. My method of choice was institutional ethnography to extrapolate from the everyday experiences of social workers and service users to learn something about the social organization of the helping relationship. The ethnographic fieldwork I'll be sort of referring to today took place at a social services department in Israel. I spent there roughly 3 months on a daily basis. I participated in the life of the department. I interviewed all the staff as well as 20 clients who are mothers. And so before I sort of dive in, a few words about the helping relationship. So the helping relationship are those that are forged between the professional, which is offering their help and services, to the service users. And these are the heart and soul of social work, documented since the 19th century. There is no dispute that the helping relationship are central to all helping professions, not only social work. And in social work, there is a wide range of empirical and theoretical scholarship concerning the centrality of the helping relationship. Yet, we have witnessed a shift away from the relationship since the late 1970s, early 80s, for various reasons that I will not go into today. Neoliberalism and capitalism have brought upon us managerialism, new public management, and austerity. And this shifted the focus away from the helping relationship. So this is sort of the context within which my project takes place. I will jump straight to the bottom line of my work. I will share my conclusion with you, what I'm sure will not come as a huge surprise for many, that the helping relationship are really doomed to fail before they even begin. So before a client and a social worker even get together, the premise of engaging in a productive, helpful relationship is also almost impossible. I have this metaphor that I've been working with for some time now, the metaphor of the room. So the room where they meet is really filled with institutional regulations and professional expectations. And here we go. That's my and sorry. Yeah. So it's really filled with all these things that are really cluttering their ability to nurture and maintain helping relationships. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is really to briefly talk about what I mean when I say how institutional regulations and professional expectations and social norms, what I mean by this, and how it really affects the helping, how it shapes the helping relationship. I will give a few brief examples, and I will then tie it all up to the idea of relationship as resistance. So I want to start by institutional regulation. And I want to talk about one example, which is the intake form. It's a good example for how institutional regulations set the helping relationship between social workers and clients in the opposite direction from what social workers and clients said that the helping relationship should be all about. And what do I mean by that? So the intake form is the first document that social workers and client need to fill in together in order for the client to actually become a client. It's a must go through document in order to register a person as a client in the social services. It takes different forms and shapes in different services, but there are always a certain kind of an intake form that needs to be filled in. And that form that I've witnessed, and it's quite similar in various departments that I looked into, is put together as a legal document. And the language and the format of this document are heavily legalized. The client is threatened by a penalty if they fail to report any change in their financial situation. By signing this form, the client is committing themselves to follow the Social Services Department regulation or otherwise face removal from the department. And by signing this document, clients relinquish their right to privacy and expose themselves to legal ramification in case they are suspected of false reporting. So this form works directly against building trust and companionship and empathy. So while social workers spoke of their attempt to fill in this form together with the clients in order to be transparent, the intake form works against their desire to build helping relationship fostered by listening, trust, and compassion. Social workers cannot choose to fill in a different form or no form at all, and the clients cannot refuse to sign this document. There is a predetermined format to follow from which no deviation is imagined. The everyday routine of filling in this form is taken for granted, and the documentation work that social workers do is thus left unquestioned. And it's a good example for how institutional regulations that demand this sort of documentation in a very certain way already are present in that room where social workers and clients meet. The next segment I want to talk about is professional expectations, and I will give one example. So one of the things that social workers spoke about is the need to tell clients who came unannounced that they can see them. In the name of professionalism, social workers explained the need to turn down clients who come without appointments because a professional social worker is expected to work according to a predetermined schedule. This was a strikingly prevalent narrative. At the same time, social workers clearly laid out the ways in which this perceived professional expectation hinders the helping relationship, because it means not being there and available for your client when they need you the most. They come to ask for services and you need to tell them in the name of professionalism, no, I'm sorry, I can't see you right now. Come back after we've made an appointment. So I was very curious to see where this professional notion is coming from, and I went to look through the texts that constitute the profession of social work in Israel, looking for a clue. So I analyzed 4 sets of official documents. These were the Welfare Services Act, the Social Workers Act, the Social Workers Code of Ethics, and legal regulations that are not law by themselves, but sort of attached to the social workers law. But I saw nowhere that it said explicitly or implicitly that a professional social worker should keep a strict schedule and not see clients who come unannounced. So what we have here is social workers not seeing clients when they come to see them because they think this is what they should do as professionals. This is their perception of what it means to be a professional, a perception of professionalism. And this is what they think they're expected to do. And actually, nowhere does it say that this is what they need to do as professional social workers. So the various documents I analyzed do speak of the importance of professional social work practice done proficiently and skillfully, but I did not find any explicit legislation or regulations pertaining in particular to a professional setting that should be maintained, nor concerning how social workers should treat clients without appointment. So seeing clients according to a schedule of prearranged meetings might present itself as a reasonable way to manage a caseload, right? So let's for a minute tear it apart from professionalism, right? So it makes sense that you want to manage your busy day according to pre-scheduled meetings. We can talk about that as well, but just as an assumption. But what caught me by surprise is the way in which this seemingly organizational arrangement was spoken of as a measure of being a professional and professionalism. So finding ways to manage a caseload and structure the day is one thing, but framing this procedure as an act of being a professional is a different matter. And that leap could not be explained through the texts that govern social work practice. it is the link that social workers made between keeping a clear schedule and being a professional that is invisible and thus goes unquestioned. The discourse of professionalism and being a professional has a profound effect on the helping relationship, because by the end of the day, when a client comes to see a social worker without an appointment and they tell them they can't see them now in the name of professionalism, that client walks away without that feeling of someone is there available to assist them. And the implicitness of what it means to be a professional social worker is powerful and invisible at the same time. The last part I want to briefly talk about today is social norms. So clients who are mothers, this was the main sort of clientele section that project was focusing on, clients who are mothers. And they spoke about the fear of losing their children, no matter what were their circumstances, whether or not they were mandated or willfully reached out for support through the social services department. They were afraid that one of these days a social worker would come and take their children. And this fear is so loud and strong and overwhelming. And what I want to claim is that this is a pre-existing condition to the helping relationship. Before they even stepped into that room where they meet the social worker, before they made the first contact with their social worker, they are afraid. And this fear coordinates the helping relationship. It's very present. And as a mother myself, I often think, I cannot even begin to imagine what it's like to live your life as a service user, worrying that one day a social worker would knock on your door and take your children because she will think you're an undeserving mother. So we have fear on the side of the client. And at the same time, all the social workers expressed much tension and conflict in relation to their work. They were acutely aware of the gaps between the underfunded and understaffed system they work in and the magnitude of clients' needs that the system is always failing to fully serve. And this internal and eternal conflict and tension was inherent to their position as social workers. So before even engaging with clients, before attempting to build a helping relationship, there was conflict and unresolved tension that fed into the helping relationship. And these states of fear and conflict are predisposition to the helping relationship. When a social worker meets a client who is a mother, there is already fear and conflict that organize the helping relationship to occur as it does. So what we have is the helping relationship, as we said, one of the most fundamental building blocks of social work, is set up for failure before it was even established. The helping relationship begins from a point of disadvantage. So what do social workers and clients do to overcome this preposition? Well, they take risks and allow themselves to be vulnerable. Against all these constraints, relationships sometimes do prevail. And this is where relationship as resistance occur. Under these circumstances, I want to say relationship is resistance. The relationship between social workers and their clients, the most basic feature of any helping profession, come to be a form of resistance. And this, for me, is an overwhelming thought, an overwhelming fighting. I don't want to glorify this. I don't want to turn social workers and clients into heroines. What I do want is to reimagine institutions where relationships are taken for granted and the circumstances and infrastructure that are needed in order to forge meaningful relationships are just there, all in place. No resistance is called upon. And for me, relationship is resistant in this context, is a troubling thought. It's a troubling finding. In other words, helping relationship between social workers and clients should be a very mainstream thing, not resistance at all. Something that is encouraged and supported and is given all the space that is needed in a systematic way. Thank you.
Thank you, Hagit. Okay, so we're going to have about a 20-minute conversation between the three of us. And I've prepared some questions. Some of these we've talked about in advance. But both presentations raised so many issues, new issues that I'd love to explore. I'm very interested in the documentary reality that you fleshed out so beautifully, Hagit. I would really like to talk about critical friends, Sarah, and these are things we haven't talked about much before today. So maybe we'll touch on those a little bit later. But I'd like to start by talking about the notion of disruption and resistance as a form of disruption. So I'm coming at your presentations, at your talks, from the academic field of disability studies, and as a long time activist and scholar within the disabled people's movement. I think a central principle within disability studies, critical disability studies, is to take up disability as a way to sense and to make sense of our worlds, and to recognize that when we start any project from the perspective of disability, that is resistance and it is disruptive. When disability enters a space, it's a desirable kind of disruption. And it's a disruption that, that is helpful to us because it starts to dismantle derogative, limiting, old, tired notions of disability as deficit or lack. But it's also disruptive because it turns this normative order on its head. It allows us to witness, to sense our world differently, to see the world afresh, to encounter the world afresh. And I think that's so evident in both your projects, that relationships as resistance are a form of disruption. So Hagit, I hear in your talk that relationships of resistance are a form of reimagination, of disrupting the taken for granted understandings of the helping relationship, the place where you end your talk. And Sarah, I love that point on your slide about disability entering the classroom as potentially disrupting the project of education, a project in which disabled people have always felt disenfranchised, have always been very much excluded from, but also been positioned as an object of study. So it's a field where that's been built up off of the backs of disabled people, even as it excludes disabled people. And so there's something so radical about the project that you're describing. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the disruptions that you encountered in your project and how those disruptions were met by the institutions.
Thank you so much, Esther. I'm happy to get us started, and I'm sure Hagit and I can riff off of each other, as there are so many parallels between our work. And I think what I found interesting, as you point out, Esther, is how just having a person with a disability in a university or college classroom creates that disruption and is a form of resistance. I personally remember, prior to even starting this research project, asking, Professor John Shields at the time, if I could bring my younger sister into the classroom. And he agreed to do that. And her presence there, as you indicate, Esther, really did disrupt in a positive way the expectations as she took out her own notebook and started to take notes. I think the expectations that are placed on students with disabilities when they enter that classroom is that they will be low performing, they will have low expectations, and they won't be able to participate and compete with their other colleagues. When in fact, we have seen through the study that I did, and others as well have shown, that actually students with disabilities are creating and adding value to those spaces in reimagining the way that education is delivered, reimagining how relationships are built in those educational institutions between students and their professor, for example, or students and peers, or the larger community in that institution or outside of the institution. And so the ability to have a student with even the most severe disabilities take up that space was in its own way a form of resistance to demonstrate that they in fact belonged, that they in fact had every right to participate and engage in the educational opportunities or institution. And that, I think, what I found through my study in particular, actually started to change the hearts and minds, if you will, of individuals in those institutions. Some interviewees indicated that there were obviously professors who were not open and receptive to having a student with an intellectual disability in their classroom. But through those relationships with that educator that were built, that educator, for example, now every year requests that a student with an intellectual disability is placed in their classroom because it enriched their own professional development in ways that they had never thought that it would. And so I found that very powerful, but really speaks to your point about the taking up of that space and how doing that in and of itself creates this form of resistance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Esther. I'm thinking about a different kind of disruption than the one Sarah was pointing to. As I'm sharing it, I'm thinking while speaking, so bear with me. So this is one of the social workers who was telling me about a client that she saw, a mother that was in a very, very difficult state. She was emotionally not well, with 2 young children, which also all immediately raises all the flags. And she really wanted to prevent the intervention of law in this case, because she was afraid that this would really escalate things and might sort of end up in children being taken away. And so she sort of set up a plan to assist this woman as much as possible to help her feel better. And so she would spend hours with her outside official office hours. She would go to her house, she would sit with her. The immediate family was not in particular very present, so she really filled in those gaps. And when I asked her how this was echoed in the department, how her manager and her colleagues reacted to this, she said that at some point she stopped telling them about this because their reaction was that she's out of her mind, she's taking on herself way too much, and that this is on the verge of being unprofessional. What made me think of this in the context of disruption is that her behavior really disrupted the sort of normal ways of conduct and how social workers are expected to carry themselves around, in a very conservative, sort of, there is where work should be done. And there is more and more we see different narratives coming into place, and suggesting other ways of intervening. But what I want to say is I don't think that her manager and her colleagues are bad people for almost shaming her for what she's doing. They have been brought up by a system which, has certain rules, regulations, policies, and it's hard to imagine deviation from those. So where in the context of our interview, I was deeply impressed by how committed she is to the well-being of her client, I can see why in a different, wider, a more organizational context, her behavior is disrupting, the expected ways of conduct in social work. So that, as you were talking about disruption, I thought of her. She was really disrupting. This was one example out of many that she shared with me. Yeah.
Interesting, because her work is also, the less she shares her work, the more her work becomes invisible and not part of the documented reality of social work or providing social service. And I'm curious about the implications of that. Does she do double, triple duty as a worker, as a professional? Because as you were talking about the form, I wondered how might we subvert that form? Can we start to change the social organization of the work by changing the intake form? What happens if you don't really fill out the intake form well? Is that a form of disruption or resistance? Or does it just, will the organization find another way of enfolding you into the practice?
That's a really good question. I've been sort of going with this in my mind for a while, this tension. And I think it's an inherent tension, and I'm sure Sarah can speak of it from sort of her point of view. There is a system here that needs to manage millions of people and large budgets. So there has to be, well, maybe no, maybe doesn't has to be a way to manage it, but in a sort of in a conservative point of view, there has to be a way to manage this. There has to be forms, there has to be regulation, there has to be rules of conduct, otherwise we might get lost. But really, is it so? Like, do we really need all this facade, all this heaviness, all these regulations? And I think sometimes I think that what's in the basis of this is at least partially fear of letting people do their job as well as they can, and sort of constraining them, making sure that their discretion is checked, and in the name of checks and balances, which again is an important mechanism when we speak about social workers, when we speak about educators. It is important to have some system of check and balances in place, but in the name of that, does the pendulum swing too much in one direction, where people, professionals' discretion and sort of ability to maneuver services and time and goods is really restricted.
Okay. Hagit, I must say, I think you're fading in and out a little bit. Perhaps if I can ask others in the Zoom room, if you have your cameras on, to turn them off, and maybe just the panel leave their cameras on and the interpreters. And that might just help with the connectivity so we can hear everyone. I will want to move on to the question of failure. And this is something that we talked about in advance of the panel. I was really struck, Hagit, by your discussion of failed helping relationships as always already as constructed as failing relationships. I think this idea of failure and success comes through both talks so well. So failed relationships and failed inclusion, exclusion, it's really at the heart of both your talks. And so thinking about failure then, gestures to possible social change, the kinds of actions, the kinds of relationships that need to be enacted in order for a more equitable, a more just situation, a more just set of conditions in which people are living and learning and loving. But I think failure within a neoliberal context is also very useful for the neoliberal endeavor. So neoliberal capitalism is always built on the tension between success and failure. So to be a successful, active citizen within neoliberal capitalism, we always presume that there are some who will be failing, who will be losing out. So that's a tension. And I think the idea of failure, though, is also necessary to incentivize the neoliberal system. So it keeps us going, keeps us invested, because if at first we don't succeed within neoliberal capitalism, we'll just try harder, we'll buckle down. At first you don't succeed, try again. But I also note in both your projects, you're talking about people who could be derogatively deemed failed citizens or failing at the project of being human. So service users, particularly disenfranchised service users, or disabled people, aren't quite measuring up to those notions of complete active human citizenship. So we have to wonder how notions of success and failure can hold promise for them. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more in both your projects about the possibilities and the dangers of both failure and success. I was thinking, Sarah, about your last example about you offered a really successful story of bringing your sister into the classroom and all that offered, and we looked at those stories. But is there danger in that as well?
Absolutely, Esther, and thank you so much for the question. I know in the conversations we've had outside of the panel, we stressed the importance of not oversimplifying these relationships as forms of resistance, especially within sort of these neoliberal constraints that we're working within, which almost create this space where that failure, one, is expected, but two, as you said, Esther, that try again. And I think both Hagit and I are very conscious of the oversimplification of the work that we've done in terms of how to quote overcome barriers, quote be resistant, disrupt, what have you. So it's important to acknowledge that we can't oversimplify these relationships. And I want to pick up on a few different threads here, because I think, both Hagit and I we are looking at populations that are often devalued, often seen as, failed citizens, as you indicate, Esther. And as a result of that, the approach to those individuals is one that often does continue to devalue them rather than create social value for those individuals. And I think that it's very important that that in what Hagit also was explaining about the sort of bureaucracy of those engaging in those relationships, how this hinders those relationships. And I think, when we look at sort of, public management approaches here, and we look at the increasing bureaucracy around, forms, as Hagit also said, I know in my research, those were things that did hinder the ability to implement inclusive post-secondary education. Many shared that they almost felt it was better to work outside of the expectations of the university or institution, because that was how they were actually going to have the outcomes that they wanted to see. Whereas the institutions or inclusive sort of diversity inclusion policy frameworks were actually going to hinder the work or those relationships and the outcomes that people would receive. And so I think, as we see increasing focus on, metrics and evaluation and expectations from, for example, a funder, that ultimately did change the way that an initiative would be delivered and created this friction between the change makers and the institution, because the expectations were now that this became a service program delivery model type initiative, which was not what the intent behind inclusive post-secondary education was. And it's actually very important to acknowledge that, because it's one of the reasons I never call these programs, because they aren't programs. These weren't programs on a campus that created space for students. These were initiatives to ensure that students had access to space. And so that was a form of disrupting even how we would think about providing opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities, because here in Ontario, for example, we do have quote, quote, programs in place for students with intellectual disabilities, versus in Alberta, they were very conscious about the language. And of course, on some campuses, that initiative was co-opted into quote, quote, programs. But the ability to navigate a sort of the changing expectations, and as we discussed, the changing political landscape in Alberta as well through different governments, also I think helped create what they were able to implement, but also helped strengthen those relationships from a grassroots community-based perspective. So I'm sorry, I'm speaking and thinking at the same time. I don't know if I fully addressed the question, but I'm trying to throw a lot out there because there are so many similarities. And I think that often that failure is seen as an opportunity to overcome. But I think it's important to acknowledge is that those failures actually helped readapt, reimagine what the initiatives looked like and how they could be implemented. So whether that was, a dean, for example, saying that students with disabilities could not participate in convocation, which was something that they did experience. It actually required other students, peers of the students with disabilities, to become advocates that they had never thought of. And so in those failures, there certainly were successes. And I think it's important to highlight that in overcoming those failures, we can't get stuck on the importance of just these relationships as the way to do that. There were power struggles, there were institutions that did not want to have those students there, and they did not have students there because it would have been detrimental to the students and their outcomes as well.
Thanks. Hagit, did you want to?
I just want to very briefly comment on and sort of try and maybe tie things together. So Sarah, you talked about how some of these initiatives were successful because there was someone championing this in the institution. They made sure that things were happening, and it made me think about what it means to be successful and what you do, right? And what it means to fail, and how sometimes we think of success as someone championing this or someone having the right set of skills to lead forward an initiative or a relationship, and then might we forget, what might we overlook again, the place of, you know, the systems, the infrastructures that put the constraints. You know, someone succeeding and doing a very good job, and you know, falling forward with a certain initiative. I want to say hooray, but I want to be very careful at the same time, and you know, not make it the go-to model. Yes, we need excellent professionals, and we need to make sure they have the right set of skills, and we need to make sure they have strong, agentic presence in their organizations and with their service users. But we need to make sure that they work within institutions that actually give them the space to do their work, and be careful of, you know, looking at those very strong champions and say, oh, but they did it, so that means that others can do it as well. So this is what sort of this is what I was thinking about as we talk about failure and success, and sort of relating to this really interesting finding from your work, Sarah.
Esther, you are muted.
Sorry about that. I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions, but I wanted to throw out a couple more questions just for words of advice. So there are two different thoughts that I have that speak directly to the Faculty of Community Services audience at our university. So the Faculty of Community Services has a strong orientation towards social justice. And I think when we think about social justice and we think about resistance, we think about it in probably fairly conventional. Our first thoughts are probably fairly conventional, where we think about large visible actions. So the public protests, the taking down of a monument, or labor actions, all incredibly important actions. And yet your work, both of the projects you describe, have a very different affective register and pacing. So Hagit, you talked about vulnerability and love in your work. Certainly in your written work, talks about relationships of resistance being built around vulnerability and love. And Sarah, you spent a lot of time in your presentation really driving home the importance of incremental, slow change. So I wondered what advice you would have to activists and advocates. That's one question. And the second question, if we can hold them both, is that we have many, many students within this, in the Faculty of Community Services, who are looking to careers in the helping professions. And I wonder what advice or practical guidance you might offer them in terms of being able to craft leadership in relationships of resistance. So you can take up either question.
Hagit, would you like to go first, as I took up so much time in the last session?
Sure. Is it better now? Luke was trying to instruct me, and maybe try. Not really. Okay, Sarah, why don't you go ahead, and I'll try to fix it. Thank you.
Not a problem. And Esther, I think it's a really important question for us to sort of wrap up our discussion portion with, because I think that, you know, some of the advice that I would share, and some of the learnings, frankly, that I was able to uncover through my project, was the importance of building those relationships, but also understanding the challenges in maintaining those relationships to create change, and how over time, creating and sustaining those relationships ultimately is what influenced the ability of, the innovation of inclusive post-secondary education to be diffused. And so through those relationships, and again, just want to underline not to oversimplify, those relationships as a way to, as Hagit and I have said, to be those champions of change. It is important that we are leveraging various networks in order to create that change, and that is what I did find in the research. I think also the nurturing of those relationships, while they were important, Inclusion Alberta, as the provincial advocacy sort of umbrella organization that helped facilitate the building of these relationships, did so over time, really helped build capacity and mobilize families and individuals with disabilities. And that, I think, was very important in sustaining those relationships over the 3 decades that I studied the innovation. And I think for those seeking a career in, social work or in the field of helping relationships as well, it is important to understand how, on a very personal level, these relationships get created. And those interpersonal relationships, those one-on-one interactions, are extremely powerful in creating this network of change ultimately that we saw in Alberta. Like I said, it really started with one family working with the right actors, moving things forward over the 30 years. And mobilizing others. And so, I think understanding that it takes time to build these relationships, they can't easily be replicated. This isn't a one-size-fits-all model for everyone. It does require a certain level of agency as well in order to foster and maintain those relationships. So with that, I think I'll throw it over to Hagit, but that would be some advice, as well as just the final word, and again, I don't want to oversimplify this, but the importance of not giving up and constantly disrupting the status quo is so important, that we don't accept things at face value, and that we imagine and work with those who want to imagine something different in those relationships, in those structures, in those institutions, to help foster and build those networks to create that change over time.
I don't think I have much to add to Sarah. I would agree with every word. Sarah Ahmed, I heard her in a very short seminar she gave at McGill a few years ago, and she spoke about the fingernails scratching against the wall. And she was sort of talking about how those scratches, they are minute, but they are there. I mean, it's something that, it sticks, it stays. You can go back and you see it, and it's a way to voice yourself. So without, again, oversimplifying or, turning this into a cliche, or overlooking the complexities, I do think that we are in the business of, scratching the brick wall. And, if we scratch it enough, and enough of us will scratch it and endure, then, the wall will eventually at some point collapse. We might not be there to witness it, but we were part of this move, right? We were part of that scratching taking place. So the place of disruption, of questioning status quo, I want to say on everyday basis. Of course, it's very, very complicated. I can't speak of I don't question, on an everyday basis the status quo of everything that goes on in my university. I don't think I would be able to keep my job if I would, but I do choose some sites where I feel I can do that, and I'm hoping that this will increase over time. So yeah, keep on scratching.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So we have a few minutes for some questions from the audience, and I would just ask that you type your questions into the chat, or if you're comfortable, particularly if you're comfortable being recorded, you can voice them. And I would need some assistance if people are actually raising their hand to do so. I'm just going to ask, just for a bit of visual assistance, are there questions in the chat?
I don't see any, and I don't see any hands raised as well.
Okay, okay. Perhaps while we're waiting, I had one other question just around critical friendships. It was a term that really caught me when I first saw it on the PowerPoint slides, Sarah, but I'd be really interested in just hearing you talk about critical friends a little bit more, or how folks could position themselves as critical friends.
Thanks, Esther. And I suppose Hagit and I did such a great job that no one has questions for us. But happy to, if folks want to let thoughts percolate and reach out to us later, please don't hesitate to. Happy to connect with anyone that's here today. But I think, Esther, in terms of the critical friends, it was an interesting finding to me in this process as well, and the role that they played, because they were, to some degree or another, policy entrepreneurs involved in the process of implementing inclusive post-secondary educational opportunities. But they also played an important role in providing feedback to those that were involved. So, constantly reassessing the innovation of inclusive post-secondary education, providing that feedback, whether it was, an academic perspective or a community-based one. These folks played that role in the adaptation of the innovation over the course of time, to ensure that it was meeting the outcomes it intended to. And so, in addition to the folks at Inclusion Alberta, there were also people and scholars connected to the institutions who provided that feedback and that constructive feedback. And so it was a constant feedback loop between those that were implementing and those that were, coined critical friends in this study as well. And they, I think, play a really important part when we think of, an innovation and it's the willingness of people to adapt it, or the readiness of those to adapt it. The critical friends helped to provide perspectives that helped make it more readily adaptable, that helped tool the innovation in a way that it could be received more effectively by an institution when presented, but also conducted research with respect to the innovation. So I think, critical friends are very important, for a variety of different reasons, because those folks are connected, but outside of the initiative itself. And so their perspective really helped over time ensure that there was merit to the innovation, and that merit was clearly understood as well as providing the feedback to constantly innovate the innovation, if you will.
Thank you.
And reimagine it, if I can just say that too. I think it's really important to have these innovations evolve. And I think even in Hagit's work, those relationships in that room do have to evolve in order to have those relationships be a form of resistance. And so if it isn't for someone looking at the intake form to say, well, here is where the issue lies, and the willingness of that institution to change the form and how it is provided, really speaks to the importance of those critical perspectives and friends in that process as well.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. And I think you're right. You did a wonderful job explaining your work. And I'm sure the folks here have quite a lot to think about, and more questions will come later. I'm going to turn things over to Ken at this point.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I've been so excited to be here. I see thanks from Nadia Burton, who's the Associate Dean in the Faculty of Community Services, who's about to leave. But I want to just really thank you, and maybe give you a moment to just say one concluding thought for each of you. What a wonderful opportunity to sit and think about active human citizenship, as you said, Esther, and the importance of who we think has failed or not a full citizen. And I feel like all three of you, both in your presentations and in your discussion, have really reflected heartfelt way to think through these things. And I thank you so much for your time today. Any concluding last minute? I see you're there, Patricia, as well. Do you want to say a word?
Just that I really, really enjoyed listening to the presentations and the discussion. I found the discussion especially, exciting and important, and it's opened up a lot of new ideas and things to think about. So thanks to everyone.
Okay, I'll give you Hagit. Do you want to say a parting shot?
It's been such a pleasure. So thank you, Ken, again for putting this all together, and thank you, Sarah and Esther and Keegan, who were working through this for such a long time. I think there's still so much to be said and done and written, and I wish, my wish for myself and for all of us, that we keep on doing the heart critical work.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Ken, and just thank you again to everyone, and special thanks to Keegan, who's been working really hard to get all of this organized with us. So, just thank you to everybody that tuned in today, and, for the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that, I did, as well as Hagit, and I'm really glad that we got a chance to connect as well, Hagit. And I suppose my parting words would be, again, not to oversimplify it, but the importance of not giving up. I think the small incremental change can have a profound impact over time. And in the case of Alberta, we certainly saw that. And in the work that I do now, I understand the importance of those small incremental changes over time through policy. As well, and the impacts that can have here in our legislature. And so I want to encourage, the students as well that are on the call, please, if there's any questions about how to navigate these spaces, how to engage in these power struggles, if you will, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to be a resource and provide some mentorship if needed. But I really appreciate our conversation today, because I think that, often for folks who are devalued, the opportunities to create change are very limited, or the notions of how to create that change are limited. And I think today we had a really important discussion about how to do this in a way that is effective, is meaningful, and through those relationships, really create that change that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Esther, you get the final word with
That's
your wonderful questions and engagement.
well, just thank you so much for inviting me, Ken. And that's really all I have to say, Keegan, for your tremendous organization. And Sarah and Hagit, what a pleasure to meet you both and to talk to you, to have this conversation.
Thank you, everybody. Bye now.